Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for the launch event for the just out today first novel by Lindsay Merbaum, The Gold Persimmon. She is here tonight in conversation with Fox Henry Frazier. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Evan Karp. I'm events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore in a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Fox, I should say, is here just by audio tonight. Very happy to have you here, Fox. Fox Henry Frazier is a poet, essayist, and editor. She received her MFA from Columbia University and her PhD from the University of Southern California. Fox is the author of 2 prize-winning poetry collections and has a new full-length called Raven King, which comes out next month from Yes Poetry. She created and manages the micropress Agape Editions and lives in upstate New York with her daughter, her dogs, her gardens, and her ghosts. And Lindsay Merbaum is a queer feminist author and high priestess of home mixology. After graduating from Sarah Lawrence College, she earned her MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College, where she was a recipient of the Hyman Brown Award. Her award-nominated short fiction has appeared in Pank, Anomalous Press, The Collagist, Epiphany, Gargoyle, Day One, Harper Pallet, and Hobart, among others. Her essays and interviews can also be found in Electric Literature, Bustle, Bitch Media, The Rumpus, and more. Lindsay lives in Michigan with her partner and cats and serves as an editor of book reviews at Necessary Fiction. The Gold Persimmon is her first novel. You guys show some love for Lindsay and Fox in the chat. Congratulate Lindsay on this accomplishment. Lindsay, congratulations. It's so nice to see you again. It's been forever. And Fox, it's so nice to meet you here. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and for leading the conversation.
Thank you so much, Evan. Thank you. It's awesome to be here. All right, let's get this party started, guys. First thing we're going to do is we're going to make some drinks. So as Evan said, I created a compendium of cocktail and mocktail creations to honor this book and turn it into a tasty experience. So we're going to make the Gold Persimmon tonight, which is the signature cocktail mocktail of the novel. And I'm going to make the mocktail first because I don't want to contaminate my shaker with alcohol until it's time to do so. But let's just quickly go over what we're doing. If you got the recipe and have ingredients at home, follow along. As Evan said, if you don't have the recipe, we got you covered. We can take care of that later. And also you can still follow along with the instructions. So first things first, for the mocktail, we're going to use Earl Grey tea as a base. We're also going to be using ginger shrub. For those who aren't familiar with shrubs, it's similar to syrups in the sense that it adds some sweetness to a cocktail, but the difference is that it is vinegar-based. So we're going to use some ginger shrub, some homemade hibiscus syrup, which looks so much like blood. It's awesome. If you store-bought yours, that's fine. We can potentially add some bitters if we want to, but don't have to. And if you don't consume any alcohol products at all, then bitters are maybe not for you. But if you're doing the cocktail version, we will use bitters, in addition to some bourbon and some mezcal. Now, I'm going to tell you guys up front, I make my drinks to match my personality, so they're kind of strong. So everyone's going to be feeling really great tonight as we progress with this experiment. But first thing, let's make the mocktail. Okay, I've got a shaker. I hope you've got a shaker. If you don't, a glass jar will do, no problem. I'm gonna add some ice to my shaker. And now I'm gonna measure out 5 ounces of Earl Grey tea. This is my handy dandy measuring cup. Super useful because it has all the different measurements because I can't do math. Okay, 5 ounces of Earl Grey tea, which I made earlier, so it's not too hot. Then we're gonna add, shake it up a little bit, tablespoon of ginger shrub. Just a tablespoon. Okay. Now our syrup. Tablespoon of hibiscus syrup. Mine is homemade. Okay, here comes the fun part. Now we shake it. Shake for a few seconds till you feel the shaker turn frosty. You can see some condensation on it. And then we simply, we knock things over, and then we strain it into our glass. And now we have a fantastic mocktail with caffeine to keep us up for the rest of the evening. Thank you so much to all the East Coast people who are staying up late. And I already put my little persimmon slice on it. So here's my mocktail. Most important part. Delicious, lovely. Okay. And now on to the booze. Now, I'm going to ditch my ice because you should always use fresh ice in your cocktail. Ice is there to dilute the cocktail and help mix the ingredients, but if you overuse the same ice, you're going to over dilute your cocktail, and that's no good. So now, on to the bourbon. We are going to use 2 ounces of bourbon. Let me find my ounces here. Okay. I told you, I'm not good at math. Woo, okay. Pour that in. We're going to do 1 ounce of mezcal for that nice smoky flavor that it adds. 1 ounce mezcal. Pour it in. And we're also going to use Earl Grey tea, but a little bit less. We're going to use 2 ounces of Earl Grey tea. And again, I really can't recommend enough a measuring cup like this that has all the different measurements from tablespoons, teaspoons, and ounces. Super useful because you only need 1 vessel instead of multiple. Okay, so 2 ounces of the tea going on in there. And now, same as before, let me shake up my shrub a little bit. A lot of shaking going on. We're going to use 1 tablespoon ginger shrub. Making potions here. And 1 tablespoon of this hibiscus syrup, which is great also in refreshers with some sparkling water and lime juice. You can use it in marinades and sauces. Awesome stuff. And the recipe is in the compendium. Now I'm going to shake it again. I have way too much fun with that. And I've got my glass already ready to go. The same glass I used in the original photos of the Gold Persimmon cocktail, first cocktail I ever made for this book. And here we go. We're going to strain it into the glass. Ooh, it's a generous pour. And I'm going to add a couple dashes of just aromatic bitters, which are like plain old regular bitters. Ooh, a couple drops. And now, again, most important part, the taste testing. Ooh, that is delicious. Yum, even if I do say so myself. Okay, so now that we've got our drink on and everybody's ready to sip and relax, the Gold Persimmon. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning and read from the beginning. At which point we are first getting introduced to the Gold Persimmon Hotel and to our lead character in that section, Clytemnestra. So I'm going to read just a few pages from the beginning, and it'll kind of give you a sense of what the hotel is like, a little bit of introduction to Clytemnestra, and probably you'll have lots of questions, but that's what the chat is for. So without further ado, this is part 1, chapter 1 of the Gold Persimmon. The lobby is cool and quiet as a tomb. The only sound, the soft burble of the fountain behind the desk. A hunk of stone with a ripple of shimmer coursing through it, like a silver strand of hair. A spring pouring forth from the head, washing over the persimmon tree carved into the rock face. Green moss and tiny white flowers hide in the crevices. The orchids shiver. Cly stands behind the desk with her hands on the poreless granite, caressing the stone. The world outside is one of car horns, garbage, cell phone chatter, the obscenity of roaring trucks, the boom and clank of construction. Inside, this is her world. When guests arrive one at a time, she studies their faces as they cross the threshold. Some of them tremble. Others smile with obvious relief, float up to the check-in desk. Welcome, Cly says, and means it. A sleek black name tag is pinned to her cream blouse just above her breast. Her long black hair, wavy, almost curly, is pulled back in a gold clip. She wears a simple gold earrings and a matching pendant in the shape of a persimmon tree. On her desk, there's a glass bowl of persimmons. She offers one to each guest. The fruit will never go out of season. It's grown especially for the hotel in a greenhouse somewhere. There are people who come here so their former selves can die, so they can transform into something else. Sometimes when guests return to the lobby to check out after their stay, Cly does not recognize them. Their faces are the same, yet not. Once in a while, someone's hair goes white. Cly doesn't know what exactly happens in those rooms because it is not her business to know. Even the guests themselves probably couldn't explain it. But she does know something about solitude, about a quiet that can be deafening. She is the priestess, offering safe passage. When Edith arrives, Cly notes her jaunty little walk, her stylish leather jacket. She smirks and simpers, the first to survey the lobby with such obvious self-satisfaction, savoring the sight of each object, the orchids, the plush couches no one ever sits on, the fountain, even Cly herself, and finding a secret pleasure in it all. When Edith reaches the desk, hands stuffed in her pockets, she looks Cly right in the eye and smiles. She says hi, slowly, with great purpose, the word accompanied by that smirk, teeth gleaming. Her voice is too loud. Cly winces. Welcome, she says, but this time she does not mean it, not exactly. What she means to say is, are you sure this is where you're supposed to be? Edith looks around again. She has no luggage, just a backpack slung over one shoulder. She tosses her head and her short, fine hair falls into her eyes. Then she brushes it away. It's light brown, almost blonde, with strands of silver. Her eyes, blue-gray, are framed by tentative quotation marks. Cly thinks she looks younger than she is. There are at least 10 years between them. As Cly rings up her reservation on the computer, Edith plucks a persimmon from the bowl and casually rolls it around in her hands. Finally, it's time for the presentation of the key. She offers Edith the shining black card in her cupped palms, the way she's been taught to do it, the way she's always done it. Edith arches an eyebrow. Really? Cly nods. Okay, then. She takes the key, allows her finger to graze Cly's palm. It's full of electricity. Zip. Going to be down here for a while? Cly pulls at her shirt, composing herself. Yes, ma'am, until 1 o'clock. Edith smirks at her again for saying ma'am. Then she glances at her name tag. If you want some company, you know where to find me, Clytemnestra. She pronounces her full name like an inside joke. With that, she saunters off toward the gilded elevator, where an attendant waits to shuttle her to her room. She hums to herself as she goes, tosses the persimmon in the air. She catches it, throws it again, a prince with a golden bauble. The next day, Cly finds on her desk a small piece of heavy cream stationery, folded in half. She knows who's left it, but she plays coy with herself and pretends she doesn't. Her hands tremble as she unfolds the paper to sneak a peek. Then she secrets it away in her pocket. The note contains no words of flattery, no poetry or little jokes. In fact, there are no words at all, just a phone number in neat block letters. Such delicious arrogance, her mother might say. After her shift ends, Cly goes home and sinks into the tub. She closes her eyes, feels again the guest's finger, Edith's, grazing her palm. In spite of herself, she imagines Edith's hands on her body, grasping, pawing. The scene is startling. Cly opens the tap to disguise the sound of the water sloshing with the movement of her hips. Sometimes she ducks under. Even submerged, holding her breath, she can still taste her mother's cigarettes. What would it be like to experience everything like this? The sound of the world flattened and distorted, rendered distant yet incredibly close. Cly imagines drifting up out of her body, floating through the bathroom doorway, then to the right toward the kitchen. There, on the table, she sees her mother's notebook full of poetry she never lets anyone look at. Meanwhile, her father paces, muttering lectures to the pigeons on the windowsill. Her parents no longer sleep. They're alert, monitoring her comings and goings, waiting for her when she gets home, no matter the hour. All their friends drifted away years ago. Their own parents are dead in countries they will never see again. Cly had the money. She would have sent them long ago to a crumbling Mediterranean villa. They would wear dark sunglasses, her mother an enormous hat, and languorously smoke long, skinny cigarettes as they lay in the shade, dying slowly in crepuscule like old world vampires, while a servant force-fed them overripe fruit. How can you work at such a place, a hotel? Her mother, the famed poetess, says over and over, spitting the words, as if Cly is a chambermaid cleaning toilets. It doesn't matter to Claire that only the best are selected for check-in. Cly knows that working at a hotel isn't really what her mother objects to anyway, that she herself in her youth cleaned houses and wore the same clothes every day so she could afford to drink espresso and write poems all night. The rules at the Gold Persimmon are what Claire can never understand or approve of. The Gold Persimmon is a precisely ordered world of musts and mustn'ts. Guests arrive at their appointed check-in desks at the mandated time, then are ushered to their cocoons for the night. They will never be encroached upon by a waiter bearing a tray, never cross paths with housekeeping's cumbersome cart in the hallway. Claire is a woman who makes a scene at every opportunity. She much prefers chaos. All the privacy measures created a great deal of buzz when the hotel first opened. Wellness influencers and Western Buddhists penned op-eds, while magazines, newspapers, and travel sites published profiles suggesting big-name celebrities and politicians were booking rooms to grieve their divorces and lost campaigns in style. But Cly has never seen a face she recognizes. The writers who produced those articles seem to miss the point entirely. Discretion is not the purpose of the hotel. The purpose of the hotel requires discretion. We'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh man, that was amazing. I've read this book probably like 3 times because I got my advanced copy and I knew I wanted to have good questions to ask about it. But hearing you read it out loud, I was just really struck by the fact that this is really a novel that reads like a prose poem. I mean, it's beautiful, like the imagery, everything, like each sentence is this like finely woven masterpiece in and of itself. So thank you for that. Like hearing you read that first page out loud. I mean, I've read it several times. I pretty much have memorized the first page at this point. But when you read it, I felt like I was hearing it for the first time, which I guess I was hearing it for the first time, but really beautiful.
Thank you so much. I remember writing some prose-driven stuff in grad school, and the teacher said to me, this is poetry. I don't know what to do with that.
Just cool. Really gorgeous. Well, my first question is actually somewhat related to poetry in that it's centered around the senses of mystery and mythology that for me as a reader were really prevalent in this book. I feel like it's just layered with mythological references and allusions. It's layered with this sense of mystery that kind of ebbs and flows. And of course, on the very first page, we meet Cly, and of course, her name is short for Clytemnestra. So I was curious, what is your connection to that particular mythological figure from Greek tradition, if you have one? And more broadly, what were some of your storytelling and or aesthetic goals in terms of how you wove mythology or a sense of myth into the novel?
Well, I'll be honest, I'm a complete mythology nerd. I'm totally obsessed with, the ancient stories. Greek mythology was the first to really capture my imagination, but I've since moved on to, Norse, and Sumerian is my latest fascination. These stories hold a great deal of power and influence to me. And I find it fascinating the way that, the magic and the way that expectations are defied in reality is just, sort of taken for granted in these stories that are such a foundation of a lot of our literature and culture. So I really can't help but make the references. They always sneak in, they always occur to me, and they're peppered throughout all of my work. But in this case, the Gold Persimmon is about many things. It's about grief, it's about loneliness, it's about gender and gendered violence and the body. And it's also about storytelling itself. And so I felt like it made sense in a way. And of course, this is me reflecting consciously on my subconscious writer mind and how I work this all out. It makes sense to explore those references when dealing with a story that is in a way about storytelling itself. To me, it sort of fits to nod to the origins of story when exploring how a story is written, and how a story comes to be. Because without giving too much away, part of the story is about how experience and trauma and observation are reconstituted in a writer's imagination into an entirely new narrative.
I like that. That's a really good answer.
I get points.
So many points. My next question is that, this book features non-binary main characters, which I loved. Obviously representation is so powerful and so important. I was struck, though, when I was reading that there are sometimes references to or discussions of struggles with identity or defining identity. And there were sections that referenced what, to me as a reader, it read like talking about body dysphoria. And I was curious why it was important to you to include these specific aspects of a non-binary individual's experience, and the development of a person's relationship to their own identity.
That's a great question. So Jamie started out with ambiguous gender. It was not actually really stated in earlier drafts what their gender was. And at that point, I was, of course, thinking a lot about Jeanette Winterson's Written on the Body, fantastic novel. And as the manuscript developed and as the story grew and changed, so did Jamie's character, and organically, so did their gender along with it. So I didn't start out saying, okay, I'm going to produce a non-binary character, or I'm going to produce this like diverse cast of characters. It just sort of developed organically within the story. And one of the things that Jamie does face is dysmorphia, but there's also various forms of disassociation and eating disorders that crop up among other characters who are cis. And, the book is so much about gender, and as it relates also to gender stereotypes and gendered violence, that I felt like it's sort of inevitable that we would see some of the effect upon that on the characters, the way in which the pressure of the external gaze and the external threats that they face would influence how they internally feel about themselves, or even how they see themselves. For example, Cly, sees her mirrored self within the mirror, as if she's, split her identity. And so I think that's an important aspect of burgeoning identity. I think it's an important aspect of the influence of, a highly gendered society, and the way in which it can fracture the self and the image of the self.
That was really enlightening for me. Thank you. I felt that the characters were all very authentic, and the struggles with identity seemed to just kind of like deepen them. On the topic of authentic representation of the characters, one of the secondary characters is a poet, and as a poet myself, I found her characterization really delightful. At times, I thought it was restrained and lovely and kind of tastefully romantic, and then at other times it was so over the top, I laughed out loud. And of course, I still found it delightful, and I still thought it rang true even when it made me laugh. So I'm curious, who or what was the inspiration for this poet mother figure?
I love outrageous women. I just do. I love characters that are fallible and complicated, and morally complicated. And I also just love writing women characters who break all the rules and, live out loud outrageously. So I had a great deal of fun writing Claire. In fact, I kind of sometimes do impressions of her to myself, like, oh, the book is at a hotel, like that's just imagining his voice in my head, and all the trouble that she gives her daughter. I just really had a great time creating her character. And what's interesting about her is that she does break rules. She does cause a scene. She does say things one should not say. And yet she also falls prey to a lot of the same expectations as other women. Being a poet doesn't save her from that. In fact, quite the opposite. She struggles with a lot of the same domestic concerns as other women. So she's an interesting sort of figure in that way. I wouldn't call her a role model, but she's an interesting sort of, composite of female identities. But there isn't one particular person who inspired her, who really inspired anyone in this book that I am consciously aware of. It's really more, any opportunity I get to write like a really sassy broad, I'm going to do it,
I love that. That's great. Even from that, I think it was the first or second page where, her mother would have said such delicious arrogance. I laughed out loud and I was like, that sounds like something I would say. So you did well by the poets, I feel. And speaking of poets, I think one of the really strange qualities, and I mean that as a compliment, one of the very strange qualities, and I think ultimately one of the big successes of this book aesthetically, is that it is situated relatively comfortably amidst what read to me as sort of myriad uncertainties. Things happen, and for me, as a reader, to my mind, they almost unhappen. There's sort of this like bewitching, perplexing synchronicity that happens. And of course, I don't want to give too much away or say anything too specific, but the fact that this book was able to feel anchored in its narratives, and narratives plural, whereas I think in other texts it might have felt too free-flowing or confusing. It didn't feel that way in this book. And it made me think about John Keats, going back to the poets, John Keats and what he said about negative capability, which is that it's the ability to sort of to comfortably exist or to productively exist or to thrive in the gray areas, in the midst of the unknown, where you sort of follow things through intuition. He called it negative capability. So why is this ability to exist in the gray areas or the uncertainties or the unknowns? I guess I might term it a multiplicity of realities. Why is that important to you? Or is it important to you? Maybe it's just important to me as a reader.
I think it's where I live as a writer. I think that's actually the space where I'm comfortable. As a reader, I don't tend to require or necessarily search for exact certainty about this is exactly what happens and this is what it means. I'm sort of like to let a story wash over me, and I sort of revel in the ambiguous. And then, more intellectually, I'm fascinated by paradox, by liminal spaces, by the in-between, the is but is not. So to hear you say that it feels like things happen and then unhappen, I think that's exactly right. I haven't heard it described that way before, but I think that's exactly right. I wanted to explore again what was possible in parallel realities with this book, and also think about how that informs storytelling itself and how that produces narrative. And I think also just, I'm kind of a greedy storyteller. I want it all. I want it to happen and not happen. And in that sense, I'm also leaving space for the reader to craft their own experience, which isn't to say that there isn't, a set narrative of events that are actually taking place. But at the same time, just in hearing different comments from readers or seeing reviews, different people took away very different things from this, and have very different ideas potentially about what happened or didn't happen. And I kind of love that. I kind of like not just giving an absolute answer. I'm down with the ambiguity. I'm down with the ambiguous endings. It's what I kind of crave as a reader. I want that space for my own experience and imagination. And so I think I just sort of intrinsically, feed that into my work. But I am very fascinated by parallel realities, by parallel stories, by the paradox that can contain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. I have similar aesthetic proclivities myself, so it's like an answer that especially delights me. And when I was reading this, I kept thinking like this would be such a great book, to read in a class or a book club, because it seems like with with so many, I think I said, what was it, like a multiplicity of realities? It seems like there would be so much to talk about. You know, I hope that this book gets taught in classes. I hope it gets picked up by book clubs, because I just think it'll be like a treat for everyone in the room to talk about what their experience was of the book.
Amazing. I can just imagine the book club getting sloshed on my cocktails. No, that's not what happened at all. You don't understand. I would love to be a fly on the wall. And yeah, I think you're exactly right. This is a perfect book to argue about in the best possible, most fun way. So I also hope that book clubs and classes pick it up. Anybody out there listening, you know, yeah, I think that'd be fun.
Yeah. And you know, what you described, getting sloshed on your cocktails and arguing, I mean, that really is like the best possible outcome for a book club meeting. So it's really just the gift that keeps on giving, I think.
Yeah, half of book clubs are just alcohol. Yeah.
So I also wanted to ask you what, if anything, you're working on right now, or if you're not working on anything new at this time, do you have any sort of like visions creeping in from the periphery for future projects? Any ideas you want to share with us?
Oh man, I've got so many ideas. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about being obsessed with paradox and getting into Sumerian mythology, my next book, which is currently with some beta readers, takes place in a Midwestern magical queer bar where goddesses and witches converge and all kinds of crazy stuff goes down. So that's my next book, which I'm working on. I
already want to read it. Like, just from that one sentence description, I'm like, I will pre-order this today if someone sends me a link.
It's pretty wild. I felt very restrained in many ways writing The Gold Persimmon. I think in part because it was one of my first books. It's my first published book, but it's maybe the third one that I've written. I struggled sometimes with managing so many characters, and also in part two, trying to get into the mindset of these characters when you can only see their perspective from Jamie's point of view. So figuring out like how I could do that. And so I feel like I learned a lot through this process. And then writing the next book has been such a completely different experience. I feel like I really let myself go. And in terms of diving into poetry, there's some very poetic driven passages. And then my next book, as I like to call it, was actually inspired by some things I read about Norse and Sami mythology. My partner was laughing at me because I was reading this giant textbook about like Norse magic and mysticism, but it's fascinating. And I would describe that one as like Outlander meets Being John Malkovich.
Which is amazing.
I just described it, so anything could happen. And I also have ideas for a sequel to the next book, but I'll have to save that until I'm finished with the next book. So the next book. Anyway, you get the idea. Yeah.
I love it. That's like a super prolific writer's imagination. That's fantastic.
It's a weird land in there. So yeah, a lot going on.
All right. I know that we had wanted to give like people who are in the audience a chance to ask questions. So I wonder if now might be like a good time to pause and see if anybody has anything they want to ask.
Yeah. Just to reiterate, if you guys submit questions through your chat, we can take a look at them and try to answer them. And there have to be questions.
And while we're waiting, what can you remind me? You said the next book is it's Being John Malkovich meets what? I want to like keep it in my brain.
Outlander. There's some like, past life, parallel life and death stuff going on, possession, lesbian marriage gone awry, there's lots of sex. Actually, next two books both have lots of sex.
Which is the best kind of book.
Yeah. I think so.
So what, well, I just figure we might as well talk a little bit while we're waiting to see if any questions roll in. What's your favorite part or favorite aspect of the Gold Persimmon now that it's done? And I mean, I guess I'm not someone who has written a novel, but I know for me, after I've finished a book of poems, and I step away, and it's a done thing that's finished and in real ink, what I call real ink. It's like bound as a book. It's out in the world. Sometimes for me, I'll go back to it and I'll think, oh, I really pulled out this like little thread that ultimately to me is very, very interesting. And at the time when I was writing it, I wasn't thinking about it at all. So I don't know if you have anything like that, anything that's favorite or interesting for you now that it's done.
That's a really good question. I think I really am very partial to part 3, to the end of the book. It took a lot of, figuring out to put that together. But for me, it kind of really ties it all in and reveals some aspects of the story that you really just can't quite fully understand until we get to that point. And it was really fun to work on that bit, though also challenging. And so I think for me, that's perhaps my favorite section is the end. But I mean, to be honest, I try not to look through it too much because, when I was editing, my editors were like, okay, you have to stop.
I'm like that too.
Right? They're like, you can't keep taking out a comma and, we cut you off. So that's another aspect of being an author that is interesting, is revisiting your own work and reading your own work repeatedly. It causes you to have a different experience of it and a different perception of it. But yeah, I would say part 3 is my favorite. I don't know. It's all my
All right. Someone named Jill would like to know, who is your favorite non-main character in the Gold Persimmon?
Ooh, this is a good question. Okay, well, who do we define as not main character? Like, is everyone in the hotel count as a main character?
I think you get to define it because it's your book. You get to define who is not the main character.
Okay. Yeah, there aren't that many characters mentioned outside of that. But there are some characters that were cut that are still kind of there. Okay, I'm gonna say in terms of like supporting roles, let's put it that way. Let's pretend this is the Oscars. In terms of supporting roles, I would say Josiah is my favorite. Yeah, for part 2.
And why is that?
She really keeps you guessing about who she really is and what her story really is. And I feel like she just keeps defying expectations over and over, but is also one of the most honest and visceral in some of her reactions to what's going on, while at the same time being something of an instigator. So again, troublemaking women, that's my thing. She's a troublemaker.
I like that.
Yeah. And she's sort of, she knows who she is. She's accepting of who she is, but that doesn't mean she's going to give it all to you. Doesn't mean she's going to open herself to you necessarily. So I don't know. I think she's a cool chick.
That's cool. Yeah. And I feel like that's an intriguing quality in characters as much as in humans, I like that. Oh, a ghost in the audience wants to know, can you talk to us about world building? Did you create a world that you wanted to return to as a writer, and how did you do it?
Ooh, yeah. In some ways, the hotels themselves are their own world. And in some ways, they're also their own characters. So, I mean, I would say that the hotels themselves provide a lot of the architecture of the story in terms of building the world. And I think creating that requires letting the imagination kind of go, kind of seeing, how that's created and what that inspires. But also just like having a lot of fun with it. It's really enjoyable to get to build something from scratch that's entirely your own. So yeah, okay, hotels exist in the real world. Love hotels or sex hotels exist in the real world. I've heard of one hotel that's for crying, which was discussed in the Crying book. I can't quite remember the author. But beyond that, I got to entirely build this up myself. I got to create my own version of New York City where I used to live. And I got to, create these bizarre sort of, realities for the characters to occupy when they're in the hotel. And I just really enjoy that kind of freedom and that kind of detail building. Am I answering this question? I think I'm answering it.
Yes. And Jill wants to know whether you did actual research on different hotels by traveling and staying in different establishments. And if so, she wants to know where you stayed. And I have to admit, like, I'm fascinated by the concept of a crying hotel. I have not heard of this before. But yeah, I'll be quiet so you can answer Jill's question.
Well, yeah, that actually was the initial inspiration for this entire book. Was I had this idea, a hotel to cry in. That was the only idea I had. I had nothing beyond that. I had no characters, but that was kind of what triggered all of this. I did not do explicit research per se. I've traveled quite a bit in my life. I've lived abroad and stuff. And so I've seen a lot of interesting and weird and freaky hotels in my life. But I'm also just kind of fascinated by hotels as liminal spaces. They're both public and private. So I think that influenced the work quite a bit. I will say, and I've written about this for Necessary Fiction, and I think that piece is coming out any day now, about how I did try to do a little retreat for one night in a hotel in San Francisco when I was still living there. And in my piece about for Necessary Fiction, I write about how that kind of went awry. But I did book myself a room in a hotel, and I brought my notebook, and I remember just like scribbling out all these different characters, trying to figure out who was inside the hotel and what could possibly happen to bring them together, which was a huge narrative challenge, a structural challenge in terms of this book. So I didn't do explicit research. I didn't travel around looking for the world's strangest hotels, but I think I've had enough kind of anecdotal personal experience and enough fascination with hotels that I could build off that. I will say I did do some research a little bit on how hotels function, like how their sprinkler systems function and, how it works in terms of staff servicing rooms and all of that, all of which I mostly changed and inverted to create hotels that are really nothing like any known hotels as far as I'm aware, including the Crying Hotel. So the answer is, I guess, yes and no.
That's great. I was thinking while you were talking, I'm working on an essay about hotels. Mine is about hotels and haunted hotels in particular. But when you described them as like liminal spaces, for me, I think that's the connection between ghosts and hotels. So thank you for articulating my entire essay for me in your Q&A.
I want to read that, by the way. I read that, and I can tell you some really creepy stories. Had some bizarre experiences in Nebraska. So let's talk later about haunted hotels.
Yes, absolutely. Kima would like to know, let's see, I'll read the whole thing. Lindsay, the pivot to online book launch has been really lonely for so many in pandemic life. You found a way to grow the literary community with your book tales. Can you speak to this or any other surprising connections that the online literary community has brought to your experience of publishing your first book?
Thank you, Kima. Yeah, so the book tales thing just kind of, developed as these things do. I was kind of dabbling in mixology for a while. I got more serious about it, leading some creative coaching workshops before COVID. I think the cocktails that I made for these workshops were probably the thing that people liked most. And then COVID happened. And at the same time, my book found a publisher. And so all of this was going on at once. And I thought to myself, what do I have to offer other authors? What do I have that's unique to me that can help other people and contribute to the community? And it turned out that what I have is booze. What I have is cocktails that I make for other people's books. And the best part about doing this project, and I've made over 40 book tales at this point, the best part is that it's a very personal experience sometimes reading someone's work. And so when I craft a cocktail based on that and photograph it using, various props that reference aspects of the book, it speaks to my personal experience with that text and sort of creates its own narrative. And so that's a conduit for conversation between me and this other author. And sometimes this real connection springs up, and this friendship develops from that. And that has truly been the most beautiful part of all of this. Launching a book is hard, period. Launching a book during COVID times is also very hard. Not being able to go freely in person to do things, especially if you have an immunocompromised household, is really challenging. So I am just so grateful to all the writers who asked me to make book tales for them, or were down when I said, I want to make one for you. And we're like, okay, let's see what you come up with. And I'm so appreciative of their responses and gratitude, and of the way that some beautiful connections and friendships have developed from that. So that has really been such a wonderful aspect of this process. And I don't plan on stopping anytime soon. I'm going to keep doing it. In fact, I'm hoping to do a book of book tales based on some favorite speculative reads of mine. So stay tuned for that.
Oh, I love that. That seems like it could be like a really, I mean, it's obviously it's a recipe book, but it could be like a really beautiful like coffee table book, because all of your cocktails are like presented so beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
And I will say, as someone for whose book you created a cocktail, there is like a really beautiful gift of being seen that I think you give to authors, right? Like a lot of the time their books either haven't come out yet or they're just out, and you're reading them, and then you're sort of like creating a reflection through like a different art form of like your experience. And I think that's really beautiful. So thank you. I don't know exactly when we want to stop. There are a couple more questions that are kind of like big conceptual questions. I don't know. I can keep going.
I think we have a few minutes left.
Okay.
So let's see, how deep a dive we can do.
Okay. The next one is from Andromeda, and Andromeda wants to know whether you can say more about grief as it relates to the Gold Persimmon.
Grief, yeah. Again, I didn't set out to exactly explore certain themes in the book. The story sort of takes you where it will. And in that way, the book reflects that process, that your own experience or observations gets reconstituted into a narrative. And then you're like, oh, okay, I guess my book is about this, or I guess I'm exploring this theme. But yeah, working through grief and trauma ended up being a pretty major theme of this book. And I think that's part of what contributes to it being viewed as feminist horror. And feminist horror really is just shorthand for fiction that is dealing with gender in complex ways through the tropes of horror. So, which can mean various things in terms of, violence or something being unsettling or mystery, etc. And I feel like grief sort of plays an aspect in terms of what is so unsettling or terrifying, but various aspects of the book, or what is so emotionally affecting. And all of the characters seem to be dealing with their own grief in their own ways. And the way in which they express that, or process it, or don't process it, has great impact on what happens to them and ultimately what happens in the story itself. So, grief and loneliness, in addition to sexuality, all ended up being pretty major themes and pretty key aspects of the characters in terms of what drives them and what holds them back.
And you just mentioned, grief and sexuality both being things that shape the characters. And this is probably, I'm thinking, the last question we'll have time for, because it's also one of these like big conceptual questions. But Dottie wants to know if you could speak a little more about the sexuality in the Gold Persimmon.
Yeah, well, Cly is kind of going through a certain sort of sexual awakening. We know that this relationship she develops with Edith is really her first sexual relationship. And, she's rather young and inexperienced at that stage. And, really so is Jamie. And some interesting things happen within the hotel that Jamie's stuck inside that relate to their sexuality. But also, the hotel that Jamie is trapped inside is a love hotel or sex hotel. It's modeled off the Japanese love hotels, which have bizarrely themed rooms, but they're designed for people to have privacy who can't otherwise find that privacy. So these hotels are paralleling each other in the sense that they are both servicing very primal, very human needs. The need to grieve, the need to experience emotion, but in solitude, and then also the need for physical and sexual connection. I think these are just key components of life, of what defines us as human beings. And I tend to be rather unabashed about writing about sexuality for that exact reason. I don't really shy away from it or necessarily consciously think, okay, now I'm going to infuse the story with some more sexuality. Let's bring that in. I think it just kind of is a key component of human experience. But in this sense, it also provides a way to explore some of the grotesquerie of gender-based discrimination and gendered violence through sort of that lens of sexuality and sexual objectification and sexual gratification. So, that parallel in terms of human needs and base human feelings that really comes through in the relationship between the two hotels. And again, what the relationship is, people debate over, but that's part of the fun.
Okay. And I think that actually was the last question that we've gotten on the list. So I think we're wrapping up right on time. I think Evan is maybe gonna come back and say something.
Okay. Thank you so much, Fox.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was fantastic.
Thank you, Fox and Lindsay. Congratulations. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I've enjoyed it so much. I didn't have a chance to enjoy one of the beverages that you made, unfortunately, but I'm looking forward to making some with the compendium myself when I have the time. I hope that you guys do too enjoy the compendium along with the book. Thank you all for joining us. And if you don't have the book yet, click through. The link's just beneath the video. I'm gonna spotlight Lindsay. She's holding it up so you can see what you need to get if you don't have it yet. Thank you guys. Thank you all for coming. And I'm gonna move the spotlight here. I'm gonna gallery at Lindsay so they can see us. I just want to say it was nice to see you again, and we're so happy to host you on this joyous occasion. Congratulations.
Thank you so much for having me. The Booksmith is one of my all-time favorite stores, so it means a lot to be here. And thank you so much, Fox, for joining me and for these fantastic questions. And thank you all for coming. This has been awesome. I hope you enjoy your drinks, and I hope you enjoy the book.
Amen. Good night, everybody. Take care and be well. Hope to see you in person soon. Enjoy the book.